So, what do you need to know about plagiarism in higher education? Well, I think you need to know that it's got things all wrong. And in this video, I'll tell you why. Okay, so plagiarism, this thing where someone uses someone else's work without giving credit to that person. Typically, this used to be where students would copy the work of a fellow student. And recently, the bigger worry is that students might use the services of professional writers via websites that offer to write a student's assignment for free. Now, universities are generally quite panicky about plagiarism, and I don't think they've responded very well to it. But before I get to that, we first have to put plagiarism in context so we can disabuse ourselves of this idea that it's a moral absolute, that we can't question it in terms of thinking of it both as a thing and as a bad thing. So first, the concept of plagiarism is culturally specific. Not everyone everywhere thinks plagiarism is a problem or is even a thing. Some cultures that see knowledge as something that can't be owned by an individual or an institution, but is owned by the collective. Well, there, you can't use someone else's work because their work is as much yours as your work is theirs. And the second thing to say about plagiarism is that it's political. It's power and status specific. So if you're a celebrity, you can have someone ghostwrite your biography, and you don't need to give your ghostwriter any acknowledgement. You know, your name is cited as the author of the book, even though you didn't write the book. And if you're a politician, well, you can get someone else to write all of your speeches, and you don't have to give them credit. But if you're a university student who copies someone else's work or uses someone else's work in their assignment, well, then they're in a lot of trouble. So universities have been in quite a panic about plagiarism for quite a long time, and there have been two main approaches they've adopted: the detect and discipline approach and the prevent approach. So the detect and discipline approach, this is all about having systems that can detect plagiarism and then imposing academic penalties on students who are found to have plagiarized. They can have marks deducted, be failed for an assessment, or even be thrown out of the university in serious cases. And because these penalties can get quite severe, universities set up disciplinary committees where cases are investigated and penalties are imposed, where students are found guilty. Yeah? It's kind of like a quasi-legal process where the university charges the student with potential plagiarism, provides its evidence, and the student then has to defend themselves against the accusation. And I've sat on quite a few of those committees when I was a deputy dean a few years back. And I've got some insight into this, and particularly about students who cheat. And I'll tell you about that in just a second. First, let's get on to the detection part of it. The detection of plagiarism. That used to rely on academic judgment. But increasingly these days, people are relying more and more on technological assistance through software programs that are provided by private companies. And the key one here is called Turnitin, which compares an assessment that's submitted by a student to a large database of other student work, as well as to published papers, and also does a general trawl of the internet to find if any text has been copied by the student. So that's the detect and discipline approach. The second approach is prevention. Now, there are three main strands here. The first is codes of conduct contracts with students. This is where students, by default, sign up to one of these contracts when they enroll as a student. And in those contracts, there's usually a clause where the student has to promise not to plagiarize. And on top of that, students often have to sign forms upon submission of their assignments. Each assignment that they submit, they have to sign this form stating that they've not plagiarized in the assignment. The second element is students are required to take a course that teaches them what plagiarism is and why it's bad. And typically it's fairly acritical. They're not taught about the cultural and political context of plagiarism. They're just told, this is what it is, as far as we're concerned, and this is why it's a bad thing. That students aren't encouraged to question whether plagiarism is bad or not. That would be seen as a bad sign. Students have got to accept that it's a bad thing. Third, in the prevention response, is a response that's increasingly being described as the preferred response and as best practice. And here the focus is on restricting students' opportunity to plagiarize by designing assessments in ways that make them more difficult to plagiarize. And they call it academic integrity, the academic integrity of the assessment. And typically, this involves changing the assignment each year so that students can't use the work of students from previous years. So changing the topic of an essay or changing the questions used in a quiz. But each of these preventionist responses and the detect and discipline responses, they have problems. So the first approach, the detect and discipline approach, this doesn't, or at least it shouldn't, sit well in an educational environment. We want our students to learn from their mistakes, not be punished for them. And the disciplinary approach can lead to staff becoming overly moralistic about plagiarism. Overly moralistic towards students who are suspected of plagiarizing. They become seen as morally bad actors. These students become labeled as cheats. And often, in my experience, we have to de-escalate staff and student responses to plagiarism because those responses often become infused with highly negative emotions like personal anger and shame, and it ends up really stressful for everyone concerned. Also, the detection software is crude. It delivers lots of false positives. It finds plagiarism where there isn't any plagiarism. And there are also many ways to get around the detection software. I'm not going to tell you about them, but because I'm contractually obliged not to. But there are websites that tell students how to get around this software, and it leads to a type of plagiarism arms race between students and software developers, each trying to outdo the other.
Prepare to proceed to specific targets.
But there's also an ethical concern about the software. Effectively, the software can only work if it can fully tap into a large database of student assignments. And the software company requires universities to hand over all of the work submitted by their students so the company can build that database of student work. In effect, universities end up handing over the intellectual property of their students to these private companies who then monetize students' work by charging the university a fee for searching that work for signs of plagiarism. The ethical issue is that it's not at all clear that students are aware that their university is handing over the intellectual property rights of their work to a private company in this way, that their work is being given over to a private company that profits from it. Now, how about the preventionist strategies? On the face of it, they sound better. Most people would agree that it's better to prevent a problem than to treat a problem. So it's better to prevent plagiarism rather than have to respond to it. But here's the problem. The main preventionist approach these days, this redesigning assessment so it makes it harder to plagiarize, is built on an assumption that has unpleasant overtones and is potentially really damaging in the effects it can have. The assumption is that students plagiarize because they can, that opportunity to cheat is the reason students cheat. That's a terrible way of thinking about our students, that students would cheat if they had the opportunity. So the intervention is built on an assumption that students are dishonest. That's implicit to the academic integrity response. And when assumptions are carried in an institution in an implicit way, when they're not explicit, but they're kind of embedded in there as assumptions, those assumptions can impact the culture, but in ways that are really hard to trace. So what we have is with this academic integrity stuff, we have a way of thinking about students that's wholly negative, that sits behind a university's anti-plagiarism policy, and we don't understand the impact of that. At best, we might imagine that it causes a contradiction with other policies built on more positive sets of assumptions about students. And at worst, it might undermine those other policies. So the assumption that students plagiarize because they can could be quite damaging. Sure, maybe one or two of our students are like that. You know, they love cheating and will cheat given half the chance. But I don't know of any students like that. In 30 years I've been teaching, I've never met such a student. And I've had to investigate multiple cases of students plagiarizing as part of my work on discipline committees and such like in the past. But I've never met one of these students who just cheats because it's easy, because they're given the opportunity to. In any case, even if those students do exist, maybe they do, I'm sure there's one or two somewhere, it would be absurd to think that all of our students are like that. And we also actually know that it's not the opportunity to cheat that causes plagiarism, it's other things. And it takes attention away from those other things. Now, there are quite a few reasons why students plagiarize, but the standout ones that really should make us stop and think are students being time poor. They don't have time to produce work that they feel does themselves justice. And this can be tied to financial pressures, students having to work in full-time employment to support themselves and their families while they're studying. And the second reason is pressure from family or friends to get high grades. In some cultures, the shame associated with getting poor grades at university is a very big issue. And shame is a highly negative emotion, and it can lead to all sorts of truly horrible outcomes. Now, if we position those sorts of reasons as among the standout reasons why some students cheat, we would be coming up with very different responses to student plagiarism than the ones we have now. Anyway, that's enough from me. I've copied all of this from the, from the website. No, I haven't. It's enough from me. That's why I think the university sector has got plagiarism all wrong. Okay, till next time. Ta-da.